Hello YouTubers, today I'm going to be discussing Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese false cognates or false friends. And what a false friend is when you have somebody who puts on some outward appearance and tries to be your friend, but when you actually get to know that person better, you realize that they aren't truly your friend. And the same thing applies here when you're studying different languages. There are words that will either be written very similarly or they sound very similarly, and you would assume that they must have the same basic meaning. However, when you actually look up the meanings of these words, they actually have very distinct meanings, and by making the mistake of assuming they both mean the same thing, you can make some pretty embarrassing mistakes. So I'm going to be going over that today to help you avoid making those mistakes. All the correct definitions will be in the description box, since I'm only going to be going over the forms that sound similar in order to make this video brief. The first example is the word Embarazada in Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese. So in Spanish this means pregnant, however in Portuguese this means embarrassed. So in Portuguese your guess would be correct if you assumed it means the same as embarrassed in English, because it does. However, in Spanish it means pregnant, so that's obviously a completely different meaning if you just assume that you put an O or the A at the end of an English word to make it into Spanish, which doesn't work all the times, and in this case would be a very embarrassing mistake that you would want to avoid. Second is borracho and borracha in Portuguese. So borracho in Spanish means somebody who's drunk, whereas borracha in Portuguese means attire. They are spelled very similarly. When they're pronounced, there is a difference in pronunciation, and depending on the Portuguese accent it could be pronounced borracha, which would be more similar to Spanish. However, they mean two very different things: tire versus drunk. Next we have taco in Spanish and taco in Portuguese. So in Spanish this refers obviously to a taco type of food you eat, whereas in Portuguese this refers to a bat. It can also refer to a hockey stick or other sporting equipment if you don't specify. If you want to say a taco as in a type of food in Portuguese, then you have to say taco mexicano to say the same thing as taco in Spanish. Next we have two words that are spelled exactly the same and pronounced exactly the same but have two different meanings. Sobremesa in Spanish and Portuguese. In Spanish it means a tablecloth, however in Portuguese this means dessert. Next we have two words that are written similarly but pronounced slightly differently: polvo in Spanish and polvo in Portuguese. So in Spanish this just means dust, whereas in Portuguese this means octopus. Next we have two words that are written similarly and pronounced exactly the same: cena in Spanish and Portuguese. So in Spanish this means dinner, whereas in Portuguese this means a scene or a setting. Next we have vaso in Spanish and vaso in Portuguese. So in Spanish this is a drinking glass or a glass of water, whereas in Portuguese this would be a flower vase. Next we have an example that would be important for business related uses of Spanish and Portuguese, and a mistake you would want to avoid. So in Spanish we have venta, which means a sale, whereas in Portuguese we have venta, which means a nostril. So obviously you don't want to say you're making a venta in Portuguese, because you're not making a sale, you're making a nostril. Next we have rato in Spanish and jato in Portuguese. So in Spanish this means one moment or a little while, whereas in Portuguese this means a rat or a mouse. So in Portuguese you don't want to assume it means the same as Spanish and say un rato por favor, to say that doesn't mean a moment please. You're asking for a rat or a mouse please. So Spanish speakers or English speakers who have studied Spanish, you want to be very careful to not make that mistake. The next is an important example when you're going to a restaurant in Brazil or a Portuguese-speaking country. A very common mistake. Both of these words are pronounced the same and spelled the same in both Spanish and Portuguese. The word is propina, and in Spanish this is just a tip that you give the waiter after your meal, whereas in Portuguese this actually refers to a bribe. Next we have a useful word for giving compliments for food, but this word has two very different meanings between Spanish and Portuguese. So esquisito in Spanish and esquisito in Portuguese. So in Spanish this means exquisite or delicious, a compliment, whereas in Portuguese this means strange or weird, which is why I have a picture of a giraffe climbing up a tree. So in Spanish this would be a compliment to say that, using this word to describe the food, whether it's at somebody's house or at a restaurant, whereas in Portuguese this would actually be an insult of saying that the food is strange or weird, that it wasn't good. So you want to be very careful in using this word and not just assume that it means the same thing. And I hope this list of 10 words helps to show some important distinctions of not assuming that Spanish and Portuguese are the same, but being careful to study each of them and to watch out for some of these words to avoid embarrassing mistakes.